Chapter 1. The gathering before the silence. Family gatherings always looked normal from the outside. Ours took place in my parents' house in the suburbs of Ohio, the same place where every birthday, holiday, and forced apology had happened for as long as I could remember. White siding. A wide front porch. Wind chimes that never stopped clinking, even when no one touched them. From the street, it was the kind of home that made people assume everything inside was safe, stable, and loving. That night, the house smelled like roast chicken and rosemary. My mother had been cooking since early afternoon, moving through the kitchen with that tight smile she always wore when company was coming. The kind of smile that said, everything is fine. Don't ask questions, I arrived a few minutes late on purpose, not because of traffic, but because I needed those extra moments alone in my car, gripping the steering wheel, reminding myself to breathe. Family gatherings had a way of turning me into the version of myself I worked so hard not to be anymore. Smaller. Quieter. Braced for impact. When I walked in, conversations paused just long enough for everyone to notice me, then resumed without missing a beat. My father sat at the head of the dining table, already holding court, laughing loudly at his own joke. My mother floated between the kitchen and the living room, refilling drinks no one had finished. My sister, Emily, leaned against the counter, scrolling through her phone like she owned the room. She looked up when she saw me, her smile was quick and sharp. Polite, but not warm. "Hey," she said. Just one word. Nothing more. "Hey," I replied. That was the extent of it. Growing up, Emily had always been the easier one. The louder one. The one teachers adored and neighbors bragged about. If I struggled quietly, she struggled loudly, and that somehow made hers more real. At least, that's how it was treated. We took our seats around the table, the familiar choreography playing out without anyone needing to say a word. I ended up where I always did, not at the edge, but never quite centered. Close enough to be included. Far enough to be ignored. Dinner started harmlessly. Small talk. Complaints about work. Someone mentioning gas prices. My father asked Emily about her promotion for the third time, as if hoping I hadn't heard it the first two. "She really earned it," my mother said proudly. "Didn't you?" Emily smiled, brushing hair behind her ear. "I guess I did. No one asked about my job, I didn't offer." This was the rhythm we all understood. As the plates emptied and the wine bottles lightened, the volume in the room rose. Laughter grew looser. Comments sharper. That was usually the danger zone. When honesty slipped out disguised as jokes, Emily was the first to cross it. She was telling a story about a stressful week, gesturing dramatically, when she rolled her eyes and said, "I mean, you know how it is. I'm always the one fixing things. Cleaning up messes." She glanced at me, just a glance. But it landed. My father chuckled. "That's true." My stomach tightened. Emily leaned back in her chair, glass in hand. "Some people just create chaos wherever they go." The room laughed softly. I forced a smile. I'd learned long ago that reacting only fed the story they already believed about me. But Emily wasn't done. She tilted her head, studying me like an unsolved problem. "I mean," she said casually, "you were always the problem." The words hung there, not shouted. Not whispered, just stated. The clinking of silverware stopped. My mother froze mid-step. My father didn't laugh this time. The room went silent, and for the first time in years, no one rushed to smooth it over. No one corrected her. No one said she'd gone too far. I felt something shift inside my chest, not pain, not even anger, clarity, because in that silence, I realized something important. They were waiting to see what I would do, and for the first time in my life, I was ready to tell the truth. Chapter 2. How I became the problem. No one spoke after Emily said it. "You were always the problem." I could hear the hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen. The faint clink of ice settling in someone's glass. Even the wind chimes outside seemed louder now, tapping against the porch like punctuation marks in a sentence no one wanted to finish. I looked around the table. My mother avoided my eyes, suddenly very interested in straightening a napkin that didn't need fixing. My father cleared his throat but said nothing. Emily leaned back, arms crossed, calm and confident, as if she'd just stated a well-known fact instead of delivering a verdict. That was the part that hurt the most, not the words, the agreement, because this wasn't new. It had been building my entire life, quietly, patiently, until it became a truth everyone accepted without ever questioning where it came from. I didn't become the problem overnight, I became it slowly, moment by moment, misunderstanding by misunderstanding, until the label stuck. It started when I was 12. That was the year my parents began fighting in whispers instead of shouting. The year my father started coming home later. The year my mother learned how to smile with her eyes empty. No one explained anything to me, of course. Children weren't supposed to notice things like that, but I did. I noticed the tension in the house, the way conversation stopped when I entered a room. I noticed how Emily responded by acting out, slamming doors, talking back, demanding attention. And I noticed how I responded by asking questions. Are you okay? Why are you mad? Did I do something wrong? Questions made adults uncomfortable. So they told me to stop asking. When I didn't, the narrative began to form. I was too sensitive. Always overthinking. Looking for problems where there were none. Emily cried loudly, so she was comforted. I cried quietly, so I was dismissed. By high school, the roles were cemented. Emily was strong. I was difficult. If she skipped class, it was a phase. If I questioned a rule, it was attitude. When she struggled, the family rallied. When I struggled, they sighed, as if I were exhausting them just by existing. I learned quickly that defending myself only confirmed their suspicions. So I stopped. I kept my head down. Got good grades. Did what was expected. I became agreeable, helpful, invisible, hoping that if I caused no trouble, I'd finally escape the label. But labels don't disappear, they wait. Every family argument needed a villain, and somehow, even in silence, I fit the role. If someone was uncomfortable, it must have been my tone. If something went wrong, I must have set it in motion. Emily learned this before I did. She learned that all she had to do was glance at me when tension rose, and the spotlight would shift. She learned she could say things out loud that everyone else only thought, she's just like this. You know how she is. She makes everything harder. By the time we were adults, the story had been rewritten so many times it felt factual. I was unstable. Emotional. Dramatic. Never mind that I was the one who moved out early, paid my own bills, built a quiet life without asking for much. Never mind that I was the one who showed up when my parents needed help, who remembered birthdays, who answered calls late at night. None of that fit the story, and stories are powerful things. Sitting there at that table, listening to the silence stretch after Emily's words, I realized something else too, something I hadn't let myself fully admit before. They needed me to be the problem. Because if I wasn't, they would have to look at themselves. Emily met my eyes then, her expression steady, almost curious. As if daring me to react. To explode. To prove her right, I felt the old instinct rise in me, the urge to apologize for existing, to laugh it off, to shrink. Instead, I folded my hands in my lap. My heart was pounding, but my mind felt strangely calm, because there was something they didn't know, something that had been buried, denied, and rewritten so many times even I had started to doubt it. But doubt doesn't erase truth, it just waits. And for the first time, sitting at that table, I understood exactly when I had become the problem. It was the moment I noticed something they didn't want named, and in the silence that followed Emily's words, I knew, I was finally ready to name it. Chapter 3, The Thing No One Wanted. Remembered. Emily's words didn't come from nowhere, they never do. As I sat there, hands folded in my lap, listening to the silence stretch, my mind drifted back to the moment everything had quietly gone wrong, the moment my role in the family was decided without my consent. I was 16. Old enough to understand when something felt wrong, but still young enough to believe adults would tell the truth if it mattered. That year, my parents decided we should spend a weekend at a lake house owned by one of my father's coworkers. It was supposed to be a reset. A break. A chance for us to reconnect. That word should have been my first warning. The house was beautiful in a way that made you feel like you didn't belong there. Tall windows. Polished wood floors. A dock stretching out over still water that reflected everything perfectly, even things you wished stayed hidden. The first night, everyone drank more than usual. Music played softly in the background. My parents laughed louder than they had in months. Emily thrived in that environment, floating from conversation to conversation, charming and fearless. I hovered at the edges. I remember stepping outside onto the deck to get some air. The night was quiet, the lake dark and glassy. I leaned against the railing, breathing in the cool air, trying to calm the familiar knot in my chest. That's when I heard voices behind me. My parents, they didn't know I was there. At first, it was just murmuring, low, tense, urgent. Then my father's voice sharpened. She's asking too many questions. My mother sighed. She's a child. She's watching everything, he said. She notices things. There was a pause, then my mother said something I have never forgotten. We can't let her turn into a problem. I remember gripping the railing so hard my fingers hurt. I didn't know what that meant. Not fully. But I knew it wasn't good. And I knew, instinctively, that I wasn't supposed to hear it. The next morning, everything changed. I didn't confront them. I didn't accuse anyone. I did what I'd always done, I watched. I paid attention, and I noticed something new. Whenever I asked about the tension, I was shut down. Whenever I pointed out inconsistencies, I was corrected. Whenever I expressed discomfort, I was told I was imagining things. You're being dramatic. You're too sensitive. You always assume the worst. Emily, on the other hand, was encouraged to speak freely. Her emotions were passionate. Mine were excessive. Over time, the truth blurred even for me. By the time I left for college, I had internalized the idea that something about me was flawed, that my instincts couldn't be trusted. That if something felt wrong, it was probably my fault for feeling it. That belief followed me for years, into relationships, into friendships, into work. I learned to doubt myself before anyone else had the chance. But here's the thing about truth: it doesn't disappear just because it's inconvenient. Years later, after my father had a health scare, my mother let something slip during a late-night phone call. She was tired. Emotional. Less guarded than usual. You were always very perceptive, she said quietly. Too perceptive. The words hit me like ice water. Too perceptive, not wrong, not unstable, not dramatic, just aware. And awareness had threatened something they weren't ready to face back then. Sitting at the dinner table now, watching my family wait for my reaction, that old memory snapped into focus with painful clarity. Emily wasn't wrong about one thing. I had always been different. But not in the way they told the story. I wasn't the problem. I was the witness, and witnesses make people uncomfortable. I looked at Emily. Really looked at her, and for the first time I saw not confidence, but certainty. The kind that comes from never having her version of events challenged until now, because the truth I carried wasn't emotional. It wasn't exaggerated, it was specific, and it explained everything. The silence at the table wasn't just awkward anymore, it was fragile. One sentence could shatter it, and I knew exactly which one. Chapter 4, saying it out loud. I didn't raise my voice. That surprised them. They were waiting for emotion, tears, anger, defensiveness. Something they could point to later and say, see? This is what we mean, I could almost feel them bracing for it. Instead, I took a slow breath and looked at my sister. Do you remember the lake house? I asked. Emily blinked. Just once. What? She said, laughing lightly. Why would that matter? My father shifted in his chair. My mother's hand tightened around the edge of the counter. I was 16, I continued. You would have been 14. Dad's coworker. The place by the water. My mother cut in quickly. That was a long time ago. I know, I said. My voice was steady. Almost calm. That's why it's interesting how clearly I remember it. The word interesting landed wrong. My father frowned. I remember standing on the deck, I said, still looking at Emily. Because it was the only place I could breathe that weekend. Emily scoffed. Okay? And I remember hearing Mom say something, I went on. Something that explained a lot. My mother's face went pale. Don't, she said softly. Not angry. Afraid. Emily looked between us now, her confidence wavering just slightly. What are you talking about? I turned to my parents for the first time. You didn't know I was there, I said. You were talking about me. My father opened his mouth, then closed it again. You said I was asking too many questions, I continued. That I noticed things. And Mom, I paused, letting the silence stretch just enough. Mom said you couldn't let me turn into a problem. No one moved, the refrigerator hummed. A clock ticked loudly from the hallway. Emily let out a short laugh. That's ridiculous. Is it? I asked. My mother swallowed hard. You misunderstood. I didn't, I said. I didn't understand everything. But I understood enough. My father leaned forward. You were a child. Yes, I said. I was. And I heard adults deciding how to deal with me instead of being honest. Emily shook her head. This is exactly what I mean. You take things and twist them. I met her eyes. What did I twist? She opened her mouth, then stopped. You said I was always the problem, I continued. But I wasn't the one lying. I wasn't the one pretending everything was fine. I was the one noticing it wasn't. My father stood up abruptly. This is not appropriate dinner conversation. I almost smiled. There it was, the reflex, control the setting. Shut it down. Rewrite it later. For years, I said, louder now, every time I felt uncomfortable, every time something didn't add up, you told me I was imagining it. And Emily learned that if she pointed at me, she'd never be questioned. That's not fair, Emily snapped. No, I said. It's accurate. My mother finally spoke, her voice shaking. We were trying to protect the family. From what? I asked. She didn't answer, because we all knew, from the truth. I looked around the table, really looked. At the faces that had shaped my understanding of myself for decades. I spent years thinking there was something wrong with me, I said quietly. Because that was easier than believing you were wrong. No one interrupted me now. The silence wasn't awkward anymore. It was heavy. Emily stared at the table, jaw tight. My father's shoulders sagged slightly, like something had finally caught up with him. My mother looked older than I'd ever seen her. I'm not asking for an apology, I said. I'm done asking for anything. I stood up, hands steady. I just needed you to hear it out loud, I finished. So you can't pretend you don't remember. As I stepped away from the table, I realized something else too. The room wasn't silent because they were shocked. It was silent because the story they'd relied on no longer worked. And once a story breaks, it doesn't go back together the same way. Chapter 5. After the silence, I didn't leave the house right away. I stood in the hallway for a moment, my hand resting on the back of a chair, listening to the room behind me breathe again. Chairs shifted. Someone cleared their throat. The world, inconveniently, continued. No one followed me. That, too, told me everything. I slipped on my coat and stepped out onto the porch. The air was cold enough to sting my lungs, grounding me in a way the room never had. The wind chimes moved gently above my head, soft and hollow, like they were marking the end of something. I walked to my car and sat inside without starting it. For years, I'd imagined what it would feel like to finally say it, to tell the truth out loud in front of the people who had shaped the lie. I'd expected relief to come crashing over me, dramatic and immediate. Instead, what I felt was quiet, not emptiness, space inside the house. The silence I left behind was doing its own work. I knew it. I could picture it clearly. Emily would break first. She always did when control slipped through her fingers. She would say something sharp, something dismissive, trying to reassert the version of reality that had always protected her. She's exaggerating. She's remembering it wrong. She always does this. But this time, the words wouldn't land the same, because something had changed. I hadn't argued, I hadn't pleaded, I hadn't cried, I had named something specific, something real, and then I had left. There was no performance to criticize. No behavior to blame, only the truth sitting there with them. My phone buzzed. A text from my mother, *, we were doing our best. *, I stared at the screen for a long time before locking it without replying. Her message wasn't cruel. But it wasn't accountability either. It was the final defense of a story she still wasn't ready to let go of, and for the first time, I realized I didn't need her to. I drove home slowly, letting the quiet stretch. At a red light, I caught my reflection in the rearview mirror. My eyes looked tired, but steady. Familiar, in a way they hadn't before. I thought about the years I spent trying to be easier. Softer. less observant. I thought about how many times I'd apologized for reactions that were simply responses to being dismissed. I thought about how powerful that label had been. The problem. It had followed me everywhere, shaping how others saw me, and worse, how I saw myself. But labels only work if you keep carrying them. That night, I didn't replay the dinner over and over like I usually would. I didn't draft imaginary arguments or alternate endings. I slept. The next morning, Emily texted, that was unnecessary. I smiled when I read it, not because it was funny, but because it was predictable. I typed back only 4 words, it was necessary for me. She didn't respond. Weeks passed, family group chats went quiet. Invitations came, then stopped. My parents called less often. When they did, conversations stayed shallow, careful, like everyone was walking around a crack in the floor, and strangely, I felt lighter. I hadn't blown up the family, I'd simply stepped out of the role they assigned me. That was the real disruption point. One afternoon, a friend asked me if it was hard, knowing things would never be the same. I thought about it before answering. They already weren't, I said. I just stopped pretending. And that was the truth. I wasn't the problem. I never was. I was the one who noticed the silence, and finally refused to carry it alone.